Okay, welcome back. I'm Cappadocia. Welcome back to World of Warplanes, Plain Facts, where we go on about aircraft from the game, see where everything was right and wrong. Today we are going to be covering the CAC Boomerang, which is a small Australian aircraft that was essentially a last-ditch defence, but we'll come to that in just a second. Now, before I jump in too deep, I just want to apologise for lack of videos towards the back end of last week. My graphics card finally gave up the ghost. It was a 2 gig card and it was producing less than half a gig. And it finally decided, you know what, I'm done being a graphics card now. So it just stopped working. So I had to get a new one. It's all in, all working, so yeah. Again, sorry about that, but what can you do? Anyway, let's jump into this little aircraft here. So, this was built by the Commonwealth Aircraft Company, the Boomerang, which I must admit always makes me giggle because I'm British and its acronym, abbreviation, initialization is CAC. Which, if in the UK you call something CAC, it means you are calling it shit. So yeah, if something is CAC, then it's rubbish, it's bad, it's crap, so yeah. This is basically, so to a Brit, say it's a CAC boomerang, then yeah, it means you probably throw it, it won't come back. But anyway, I am about, yeah, my sense of humour sometimes ranges to about that of a 12-year-old, so it's not really surprising that makes me giggle. But basically, a lot of, maybe worth going into, like, who CAC were another time, but essentially a group of Australian aircraft manufacturers merged into one. At the behest of the Aussie government, which at the time obviously was part of the British Empire, to produce locally made aircraft, and this was one of them. Essentially, aircraft, although some were loaned from the US and some came over from Britain, there were a lot of aircraft that they were not able to get their little mitts on. Just because obviously Australia is a long way away from the UK, so it's kind of hard to get it down there. Yeah, so they designed and built this thing. The idea was basically in case Japan came along and invaded, they needed air cover that they could repair. They'd have the parts to do. So, yeah, essentially borrowing aircraft and loaning aircraft is all well and good. They can repair some of them, but parts can be quite hard to come across. So designing, building, making your own is all well and good, and it helps in that regard, especially when you consider obviously the war in Europe was still going on, so a lot of the equipment that the RAF were making and British manufacturers were making were being used. So anyway, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation designed and built this thing. It started life as, well, it was designed to be a fighter aircraft. And so they looked at what they could use for parts of it. And one that was already there, that they were already making, was one we're going to cover later, which is the Weatherway. And so they took parts of the elements of that design, and basically made it so that they could use components from each other. So that way you're repairing two planes with equipment that you're already making. Which, obviously, a great idea. So they worked on it. The Weatherway was what they were looking at, and they decided to build this thing. Obviously, you also had the Beaufort that was being built in the area, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. So they built the thing. It was carried an armament of 2 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons and 4 303s. The Hispano-Suizas were also replaced eventually for their own. Again, the same reason, same logic. If we're making these things, we know them, we can repair them. It wasn't a bad plane per se. They tested it against one thing that makes me chuckle a little story, they took a Booster Buffalo and weighted it down. They lightened it off, trimmed it down a bit to try and give it the same flight characteristics as best they could as a Mitsubishi Zero, and decided to test the Boomerang against this thing. While the Boomerang was faster in level flight than this Mitsubishi Zero, but it couldn't outturn it. But it also had more weapons, so it was more heavily armed and better armoured than the Japanese fighter. With the shorter, stubbier wings, thicker wings, and the actual cockpit being properly armoured, meant that the odds of survival flying one of these things were actually a lot higher. It was good at low level, but it wasn't great when it got into high flights. Yeah, it wasn't really much of a high altitude aircraft, which obviously gave it problems. But it did what it was intended to do. I think that's the important thing. They carried on developing it. They ended up replacing the engine that they would use in it later on. They used a Pratt & Whitney R2800, which produced 1,850 horsepower. And they adjusted the propellers, bits and pieces like that. But yeah, it was originally around a Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp, driving a 3-bladed propeller. License built setup. It wasn't the original. It was built by the de Havilland Aircraft Company, so Jeffrey's back again. And yeah, it was not a bad aircraft, really. It never really got into the role that it was never eventually needed for the role it was envisaged for. It was envisaged as a defence aircraft. But one thing they did do with it, which I always found quite interesting, is that underneath is you can't see it on this one, but it has a ventral drop fuel tank, built in. Well, not exactly, but you get the idea. And the idea was that because Australia, very big, needed a lot of range to cover the sea all around it, around the islands, bits and pieces like that, just to keep an eye on what was going on, because most aircraft at the time fairly short range. And so they added a ventral drop tank to it, and when it wasn't using the ventral drop tank, if they took that off, then it could actually carry it was a hard point, so it could carry bombs, it could carry small ordnance. It was never designed to be. I think of this as like the aircraft version of the Charlton automatic rifle, in that it's a stopgap. It's not something that was ever really designed to be a premier fighter aircraft. It was designed as a kind of stopgap. Look, we really want something like a Spitfire, but or Assault Mustang, something like that. But we can't get them because Australia is in the arse end of nowhere, and it takes a long time to get anything there by sea. And if you're going to try and fly these planes here, you're going to have to stop at a lot of places on the way. And let's be honest, most of those places at the time were either in Japanese or German custody. And so the odds of being able to get from the US or from the UK without bumping into someone who's going to be a bit pissy with the fact that you're flying through their new territory is negligible. So they needed something they could build at home, something that they could use, but it was never going to be a top shelf fighter. They could license engines and build them down there, but again, getting the components and the materials, not the easiest thing in the world. So they had to do a bit of a balancing act. And you can understand why they would do this. Now, eventually, the plane, there is no record of a Boomerang ever shooting down a Japanese aircraft. Never. So in that regard, as a fighter, it kind of failed. It was eventually used as a close support role. And we'll come to this in a minute, ground attack aircraft. Because it had the long range to go, it had heavy armament, it's fairly agile, so it can get close in, fire through whatever terrain is there, and still have the ability to get out. Although there were problems with that. A couple of them were shot down by the Americans, and it had a tendency to have problems flying at that close to the floor. So it wasn't really designed for that, so it's kind of a bit of a mismatch, and a bit of a mixed match, and a bit of a problem for it. It was designed to be one thing, wasn't really very good at it, came out the other side with a new role, which it was sort of shoehorned into almost, and it didn't, because that wasn't its design, it didn't do it as effectively as people would have liked. But can you really blame the plane for that? No, it's designed to be a fighter, so, you know, making it into a ground attack, it's going to struggle. It was light, it was nimble, it was fairly quick, and quite heavily armoured, which is why I thought, oh, well, maybe ground attack would be more... But it was designed to fly at mid-level, mid-range. It was not designed to skim along the floor. So there are problems with that. Yeah. So there's plenty of issues with it. Plenty of variants of it. I think there was like... There's six different variants, I think. One was used like tactical recon aircraft, I know that. One used a turbo supercharged engine, but that never went anywhere. To be honest, at this point, probably not a good idea trying to shoehorn like a massively powerful engine into a short, stubby aircraft like this, just because it's not going to be able to use it. It's really not, which is problematic in its own right. But was it a bad plane? It had its issues. I think the fact that it was, like I said, essentially designed and built as a stopgap, because basically the fear in Australia at the time was the Japanese have spread all over the place. They could invade any day now, which, while not entirely accurate, was not necessarily wrong. The Japanese were getting close, and there was that possibility, and so they needed to do something about it. They needed air defense. This thing was never going to take on a Zero, let's be honest. Even though it could outrun the Zero at low level, it was never going to be able to get high enough to be able to engage. It just didn't work like that. So, fairly flawed from the outset. Looking at the way it moved, I think it had potential, but when you look at aircraft already available that are already maximising that potential, they're miles ahead in the development stage than the Boomerang. So, whilst it was forced into a role it was never really designed for, you're looking at it and you think it could have had potential. It could have, you know, modifications to it, adjusted a few bits. They could have done something with it, but like I said, with the way the Spitfire was already so far along in its developmental stage, it was just so much better than this. And are you going to pump, if you're part of the Australian setup at the time, which, like I said, was part of the British Empire, are you going to be looking at this and thinking, you know, we could really work on this and do it well? Or when things start to ease up, supply routes are now getting through, Japan has been driven back, the threat of invasion is not quite so heavy, why would you spend time developing this when other planes are available that are further along in the development cycle and work better? Doesn't mean to say the Boomerang couldn't have done something, couldn't have been a useful tool, and on top of that could have found a role for it, you know, something like a yeah, if they'd have... One thing they could have done with it, if they'd have stripped out the machine guns and put in another cannon, for example, one maybe through the nose, or alternatively another couple on the wings instead of the machine gun, so it came 4 of the Australian CAC auto cannons. It could have been useful as a ground attack hunter, given the fact that it was agile, it was fast. For a ground attack aircraft, for a low-level aircraft, is when it did its best work, so hunting down ground attacks would have been perfect for it. It just didn't have the firepower to do it, really, because most ground attacks, obviously, you needed that, they had that heavy armour because they needed it. And so, but there were possibilities for it. But sadly, there's a few surviving now, but it didn't really do that well. It really didn't. Its top speed, 265 knots, 305 mile an hour, I think that is, or 491 kilometers, depending on which version you want to do, at 15,005. It's not that great. Which is also a problem. for it. So it had its good points, had its bad points. It was never going to be an apex fighter of the day. When you look at the development cycle and you look at everything about it, I have a feeling that I know why it was sort of... Because of the fear of the invasion, because the Japanese were on the door, at least that was the theory at the time, they rushed it. They needed something that they could throw into the skies to try and take on the Japanese. That was the big worry. So, hence the reason it needed the additional fuel, because if it's going to go out over the water, away from Australia, you're looking at Australia, obviously New Zealand, New Guinea, all of that lot. Or it needed to cover a wide area, and Australia being a big island, the sea between Australia and New Zealand, you're looking at a large area to cover. So they rushed it. They rushed a plane. Hence the reason why they had the ventral fuel tank instead of the ventral drop tank instead of the bigger internal tanks, or wing-based hardpoint drop tanks, which is a shame. It is not, like I said, it's not the greatest aircraft, but it did its job. It was rushed into service, rushed into design, and it was held on to stop the Japanese, and that was its whole life. And it didn't do it very well, because you'd have had Zeros dropping in from miles above, causing them all sorts of problems, because it simply could not get high enough to take on the Zeros. But the Mitsubishi Zero was designed to be an apex fighter. It was designed to be the predator of the skies. That is what they wanted it to be, and that is exactly what it was. This thing, the Boomerang was never going to compete. So, sad little blip in Australia's history, but it did the job. It was forcing, like I said, you got a kind of feel for it, the Boomerang as a plane, because it was designed quickly, just rushed into production, rushed into service, and expected to go up against something that had spent a lot of time being developed and a lot of time being adjusted and a lot of time proving its worth. And this was never given that opportunity. And so, when it was pushed in, it was in trouble right from the word go. It's not a bad plane, but it couldn't match the Mitsubishi in the climb, couldn't get as high as it, could not really reach the operational ceiling of the Zero, and then, the only thing it could really do was outrun it on the ground. So when it goes low, it can outrun the Zero. That's helpful to get away, but in a turning fight, the Zero's going to outdo it. The Zero was just more agile and more nimble, and so even though it was lighter, it was less heavily armoured, so this thing could survive a bit longer. And if it got onto the tail of the Zero was in trouble with the two 20mm cannons and the two machine guns. It was going to cause problems. Where the Zero didn't have that heavy level of armament, and we'll come to the Zero another time. So, what have they done about this in the game? Now, first of all, obviously they've made it a fighter when it wasn't a pure fighter. It was used as a patrol aircraft, it was used as a recon aircraft, it was used as close air support, it had hard points for bombs on the bottom. This one doesn't have the ventral fuel tank, and the model in the game doesn't have the ventral fuel tank, nor does it have the hard point for bombs. So it was, realistically, it was a multi-role. It should have been in as a multi-role. Secondly, it's in as a British aircraft. Admittedly, it is a premium aircraft, but it's in as a British aircraft. Well, it should be in the international section, realistically, because it is not British, it is Australian. You may argue, well, Australia was part of the British Empire at the time. Yes, it was, but it was a self-governing colony under the Empire. So while it was part of the British Empire, it wasn't directly controlled from London. It was controlled by its own council. So while it shared a lot of things with the British Empire, a history, the monarchy, its oaths, its setup in the army with the guns they were using Lee Enfields that they were producing themselves. So while they did share a lot of things, they also did a lot of things on their own. Because they kind of had to, because they were so far away. So it is not British under any... Oops. Under any sense, this thing is not British. I don't think you can call it that and be fair to it or to Australia. So I think this and the Wirry should be in their own. In the international section of the planes, this should not be under the British aircraft. Next of all, I mean, you look at the speed it's doing. I mean, I'm having to really G it up to give full blast to get up to 400. Admittedly, I've lightened this one. I prefer fighters to be a bit more nimble and agile than fast. So, yeah, I have lowered the speed on it a little bit, but still, that's neither here nor there. So it should be a bit faster than this. In the game, it doesn't turn very well, and it's not particularly fast either, so it's kind of a struggle to get this thing into position. And on top of that, it doesn't have the firepower that it should. I mean, it's got the 2 Hispano-Suiza cannons on it, and it's got the 2 machine guns. But when you pull the trigger, it never feels like it's got enough weight of fire, if you know what I mean. That's for a plane that was designed entirely around that. Kind of gives it a bit of a problem. And also, like I said, no hard points, no ventral drop tank. So a lot of the things that made this plane stand out just aren't there. Which is a real shame. It really is. They should really have made it, the roles that it made it known for, it was ground attack and for some bomb flights and recon. So putting it as a pure fighter, again, I don't think it is right. It would have made an interesting addition to the ground attack setup. I mean, this and the Wirry would have made an interesting ground attack setup from Australia. Or as a multi-role. Because that is where it made its name. Yeah. It's also not as fast as it should be. It does struggle at high altitude, but again, that comes down to the speed issue. Yeah. Also, this thing I find, excuse me, is a little bit light on armour than the real version was. This thing is a bit easy to take out. The plane itself, the reason why the pilots liked it is because of the armour. It was heavily armoured around the thick wing set that it was given, the heavy thick wings to mount the cannons and the machine guns, were good at deflecting shots. And the cockpit itself was armoured. So the fact that you had a high chance, if this thing did get into trouble, it had a high chance of surviving. Or at least you did. The pilot had a good chance of getting out. And that's what most pilots want. They want a chance that if they are a fighter pilot, if you're in this shit, they want to be able to, if they ditch the plane will keep them alive. That's what they want. And this doesn't kind of give you that feeling when you're flying it. Which isn't the best of things. So, to sum up, they got right the fact that it is a bit janky in the air. They got right that it's not the quickest thing in the sky. Realistically, they got wrong in the fact that it's the wrong role. While it was designed as a fighter, it never really made an impact as one. It made more impact as close air support and as ground attack. So, what would I like to see them change? I'd like to see them give it a bit more health, just purely because of the armour around it that kept the pilot alive. And on top of that, I would like to see them adjust it so it's either a multi-role or a ground attack. Just that is where it was used. That is what it was good at. Like I said, there's no recording of this thing shooting down anything. So putting it as a fighter is a little bit silly. But there we go. So that is a brief history of the CAC Boomerang. And obviously where it belongs in the game. So I haven't gone too deep into the history of it. I can if you'd like. Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to see like, a deeper dive into the history of this thing, or of any of the planes in the game, I'm more than happy to do so, but it would just take me a while to get some sources together some more sources together, shall we say, because I've only got a few. Yeah, just to be honest, at the moment I am a historian in training. I'm in university at the moment doing my degree. I've been studying warfare history for a long, long time. Out of it, I love military history. Some of the aircraft that I've come across in those studies have been really interesting to me, so that's kind of why I enjoy the aircraft military history side of it. But if you do want to see a deeper dive, let me know. I mean, I'm quite happy to pump out an hour-long video on the damn things, but if anybody's interested, I'll do it, but if you're not, I won't bother. But anyway, I'm going to leave that there for now, and I'll let you enjoy the last minute or so of this flight. So again, thank you very much for your time. Over the minute, I've been Cappadocia, signing off.